Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Hometown Heroes. I'm Mike Kenichi, and this ball right here, folks, is very special to me. It's part of my sports collection, and it was signed by today's guest, who I've been a fan of since around 1997 when I really got into the fan. He was Joe Beningo's update guy for a few years, and the last 22 years, you know him well as WFAN's beat reporter for the New York Yankees. It is my honor to introduce to you a man who really needs no introduction, the one and only Sweeny Murti. And Sweeney, I want to thank you for coming on today. It's a real honor.
Yeah, I can't believe you still have the ball. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, Sweeney, I wanted to have you on because, like I said, I've been listening to FAN for many years. I mean, you're heard so many times on that station, and I had Ed Coleman on last week. I said the same thing to him. I mean, you guys are on almost everybody's show because you have to give updates. But I want to ask you, I think the love for baseball, it really began at a young age, and you were a Philadelphia Phillies fan, correct?
Yeah, I mean, listen, like all of us who, you end up loving sports and growing up with it in different ways. I grew up in Middletown, Pennsylvania. It's about 2 hours west of Philadelphia. My parents had lived in Philadelphia when they first moved here from India, so they got attached to Phillies baseball. I grew up watching Phillies baseball, and I grew up watching them at a time when they were one of the best teams in the entire league, with stars like Mike Schmidt and Steve Carlton and Pete Rose and Greg Luzinski and Larry Bowa and Bob Boone, whose son happens to be the Yankees manager now.
Yeah.
So those are the teams that I grew up watching and really learning how to watch and love baseball with.
Right. And the funny thing is, Sweeney, you were a big Phillies fan back then, but you had aspirations like we all do as a young kid. You wanted to be a shortstop for the New York Yankees, correct?
No. Actually, if I wanted to be anything for the New York Yankees, it would have been center fielder because I was a
Center
big
fielder.
Mickey fan.
Yeah.
I think I did it probably in fifth grade or fifth or sixth grade. Several times, fifth grade, sixth grade. I think again in eighth grade, I did book reports on Mickey Mantle.
Yeah.
And I remember my first trip over to Cooperstown was in 1983. And I was 13 and I bought a Mickey Mantle poster that hung on my wall throughout like the rest of my high school years. So, and it was weird because I didn't think when I first started learning and reading about baseball history, he was one of the ones that stood out to me. But I never saw him play. He retired, before I was born. So it was just kind of like the myth and the legend of Mickey Mantle that, people of that generation grew up with and started passing along, like in books and everything else that I got attached to. So if I was going to do anything with the Yankees, especially because remember, growing up with the Phillies in 77, 78, 79, 80, like the Phillies were really good, right? And the Yankees were in the ones in the World Series against the Dodgers a couple of times, and not the Phillies until 1980. So the Yankees were not my favorite, and it was just something about their history that I certainly enjoyed, though.
Right, and we know you went to Penn State. You're a Penn State graduate, but were you a fan of Penn State football before you went to the school? And wasn't your father an assistant professor for economics at Penn State?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The Penn State Harrisburg campus, he was an assistant professor, and he taught there from up until 2003. So from the late 60s up to 2003. We were fans of the program because again, it's late 70s, early 80s, their program there as well. So
right.
It was probably my father working at the Harrisburg campus. I had an older brother who went to the main campus, and so it was probably just lined up for me to end up there anyway. They didn't have a really well-established communications program yet. I think they were really just kind of getting one off the ground, probably 5-8 years before I got there. But I started working at one of the radio stations in town there right when I got on campus, and it really helped me get off the ground.
Right. Now, let me ask you, I know you're a big baseball guy, but were you into the Philadelphia Eagles being from the Philadelphia area? I mean, did you root for them, or were you not as big a football fan?
No, it's funny. At a young age, I guess, like everybody else, I got infatuated with a star, like Tony Dorsett and Roger Staubach and Cowboys. I kind of ended up growing out of that after a little while. and never, when I remember actually it took a little while. Like I was probably a Cowboys fan like all throughout my high school years. And then when I moved to New York I first started as a producer at FAN in 1993. Um, this is before Sunday Ticket and any of those other things. Like I watched, you had two football games. One was a Jets game, one was a Giants game.
Yeah.
And as my role as a producer, I relied pretty much every Monday and Friday on reaching out to both teams and trying to get coaches or players on shows. Ed Coleman was hosting one of them. So I was locked in on watching both of those teams and getting to know them as well as I could for my job. And whether or not they won or lost had a direct impact on my ability to get players on the show. So you kind of end up putting all that aside and just, you root for your job. That was like one of the early lessons of understanding like fandom didn't really mean much to me. It was about, making sure that, what you needed to do your job was in line. So I started following Jets and Giants a lot more closely and, rooted for them to win because it made work easier.
Right. So let me ask you, Sweeney. The Phillies did go on to win the World Series in 1980. Dallas Green was the manager. I even believe Pete Rose was on that team. You had Mike Schmidt. I mean, you had Carlton, guys like that. You had great guys that played on that team. And I know as a Yankee fan, I would hope when I was a kid they'd win. And they didn't win until I was about 20 years old. So let me ask you, you're a fifth grader. Could you appreciate it back then, or was it not the same as maybe if you were older and saw it?
I think even more so. I think 10 years old is like, wheelhouse for baseball fans. I think when you start to be like 8 or 9 and when you could start to read the newspaper, okay? You knew enough to read the newspaper and you could read the sports page. And when you learned long division, so you could figure out batting averages and earned run averages, when you knew how to do those things, all of a sudden, I think, you're kind of locked into all these different things and then you read about, read books about the history and you learn about Mickey Mantle, you learn about Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Roger Maris and, Jackie Robinson, Frank Robinson, Hank Aaron, everybody, right?
Yeah.
You start to really get into this wheelhouse of baseball. Plus, you're collecting. I was collecting baseball cards, and that's an era when that's one of the easiest ways to learn about baseball was flip the card over and read back. Right? You could see everybody. You could see everybody's stats and learn different things. And that was a fun way of doing it too. So 10 years old was perfect wheelhouse for all of that. I actually remember reading somewhere, and I've quoted it often. I don't remember who said it. But every baseball fan really just wants the game to be like it was when they were 10 years old.
Yeah.
And that means a different thing to every generation, right? Like, if you were 10 years old in 1955 or if you're 10 years old in 1995, those are two entirely different things, but that's how you're locked in on baseball, where you remember it from that era of your childhood. And I still remember staying up, to 11:30 at night to watch the end of the game and past midnight to watch all the clubhouse celebrations on a school night to watch the Phillies win the World Series. And when they ended up winning on a Tuesday night, I still remember waking up and going to school the next morning as a fifth grader with that feeling of, oh my gosh, my team just won the World Series.
Yeah.
You want to go to school, all you want to talk about with everybody. And that's something I think you can only truly appreciate at that age, like it's because what else is going on in your life that's that important when you're 10? Your team won the World Series. That's the only thing that matters.
Right. And you make a real good point because I remember being 10 years old and it was that Red Sox Mets series in 1986 and just a classic series. But that's really like when I watched the World Series, I really got into the game of baseball, and that was a great World Series. And one thing, Sweeney, that I kind of miss from that childhood is those baseball games of the week on Saturdays when it was Vin Scully and Joe Garagiola. Yep, and stuff like that, because those really got you pumped up. I mean, the coverage was so good. And today, like, I'm not saying the coverage is bad, like when Fox does it or TBS, but there's so many commercials. There's so many different things. I really loved those games of the week back then, whether NBC did it or ABC did the Monday night game. It was just such a fun time to be a kid and watch Major League Baseball.
Well, I think your perspective changes. Like when you're 10 years old, it's a baseball game. This is all you know. I think when as we get older, there are different things that cloud our mind, and we're watching for different things and think about different things. And there's I don't think there's really a comparison. I think the production quality of the games today are amazing, right? I
Yeah.
mean, there's lots of different things, but um, it's all just kind of in front of you when you're 10, and that's pretty neat.
Yeah, it definitely is. Now, I had read somewhere that your first introduction to like broadcasting kind of happened in seventh grade. Talk about that a little bit, because again, I think that's when we all like watch baseball or watch football, whatever it is. We see play-by-play announcers. We really, emulate, and we want to do that. So, I mean, talk about that experience a little bit.
I told you I'm from Middletown, Pennsylvania. And in 1978, the school district in Middletown, I was still in grade school, they started a radio station, a local radio station. It started out as 10 watts for the community, and gradually it increased in power to expand to like a greater area around Middletown, Harrisburg area. But it was 91.1 FM WMSS. It was a real operational radio station, and it was kind of a full service station. It played music and news and sports and church services to the community and things like that. You could join. Any students between seventh grade and 12th grade were eligible to work at this radio station. And so in seventh grade, I joined the radio club to join the radio station, and I began working there. And I began doing like I said, playing records and reading news and things like that.
Yeah.
My friend John Wilsbach is 5 years older than me. He was at the time a senior in high school, and he was the student manager of the radio station. He was also did play-by-play and was a sports director as we did play-by-play of our school's football and basketball games. So he reeled me in and got me started in it. And so I started broadcasting games. I probably was on my first game, I think, in eighth grade. I did play-by-play really for the first time in ninth grade. And, that was the bug. That got me hooked. All of a sudden, I started recognizing that these games that I listened to and watch on TV, that's a real job. And, I can, and I started to get good at it. I started to get better at it, and I started to say, you know what, listen, like this, I was all into sports. I started, it was a real profession, and I started just soaking in the broadcast, and I'd be watching and listening things differently. I'd be watching for the broadcast, and what WMSS gave me was a head start that I couldn't get anywhere else, and it was about getting the bug and really just helping me get started and introduce me to this world. So at that point in time, it was invaluable experience. It just set me up for everything else I was able to do along the way. It really was like just a great launching pad for me.
Right. Now, if my math is correct, you probably graduated high school in 1988, I believe. Yeah. So FAN was probably in its second year of existence, and they were still kind of trying to establish themselves. There was no Mike and the Mad Dog yet. I think they were bringing in Imus at that point. But let me ask you, being a Philadelphia guy, had you heard about the station yet or not at that time?
Had never heard of it. And I never heard anything coming out of the radio station until I actually walked in for my internship. When I was at Penn State, I was looking, it was made perfectly clear that, your path into any of these places is through internships. So I started looking, even like, I think as a sophomore, I started trying to figure out where my internships would be. And at the end of my junior year, I got an internship for the summer at WFAN. I got an interview during my junior year. So I went up during spring break of my junior year for an interview, and I walked in the door at the radio station. The only reason I'd applied, well, the fall of my junior year, I was looking at places to apply to, and one of the students in one of my communications classes had just finished an internship at FAN, and told me like what a great experience that was, and told me a little bit about it. And the only thing I really knew about it was that it carried Mets games. Right. I think what I was looking for places that broadcast Major League Baseball. So I was looking at KDKA in Pittsburgh and the Phillies radio station, and I think Home Team Sports in Baltimore was the TV, kind of the precursor to,
right.
It was their local like MSG at the time. And what where the games were. So I was looking at all these places like close by, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, that would broadcast Major League Baseball games. And at that time, you look up information and something. Broadcast Cable was a magazine, and they had a yearbook every year they'd print that listed every radio station in the country and TV station in the country. You can go check it out at the library and go look it out. Go look up all these different places. You find addresses and phone numbers for every place. And I just wrote letter. And actually, my friend Doug Lebo, who was in my class, told me the name of the person to contact at FAN was Eric Spitz. So I wrote a letter to Eric Spitz at WFAN and told him I was interested in an internship. And I sent along a resume that included all my like high school and my college experience. So I got an interview, I got the internship, and that's where everything kind of started for me. I knew nothing about the radio station except that they were an all sports radio station, which I read, and I didn't really know what that meant. I knew they carried Mets games. And that was my interest right there. So like FAN launched and started to become successful. And I knew nothing about the revolution of sports talk radio. To me, like where I was growing up, sports talk was like a 1 or 2 hour show at night after all the important news of the day. And, it was a 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock PM kind of show that local stations would carry. And, that was sports talk as far as I knew it. So it was a whole different world that I got introduced to. And, fortunately, listen, how fortunate I was to get that internship, again, set me up for everything else that was to come. It was really special.
Right. So I would be willing to guess, Sweeney, that you probably walked in there not really nervous because you didn't really know about that station. I think maybe if you knew the success of it, because at that point, Mike and the Mad Dog had taken off. Imus obviously was big. I think you would have been a little more intimidated maybe, but I think because you didn't really know much about it, it had to be a little easier. Right.
Maybe like I was fairly cocky at that point too, because I had done all this work in high school and in college, and I probably carried myself a little bit more confidently than I had a right to. But you're right in that, like, I didn't know who Imus was. Like, it wasn't syndicated yet, so it wasn't anywhere near me where I lived. I remember my first day in the studio for my internship. I remember seeing Mike and Chris walk out of the studio in a break, and I looked at Mike and said, "Oh my gosh, that's Mike Francesa from CBS Sports." Like, I knew him as the college football and basketball guy. So I had no idea that he was a host there, or that what Mike and the Mad Dog was. And during the course of that summer, obviously I listened to the radio station a lot, and I picked up on all the things that was happening with those guys. And I learned a little bit more of the history of the radio station because in July they celebrated the 4th anniversary of the radio station, which is crazy. We just finished the 35th anniversary, but I remember them doing playing a lot of clips and talking about some of the early days of football and stuff like that. And Imus was, I think, the week I got there or started my internship, or shortly after, Imus was a cover story on in New York Magazine, and I think there was there was clearly a big to do there, and I was just learning about it.
Right. One of the things, Sweeney, you mentioned you became a producer in 1993, and I find it fascinating back then because there were really no cell phones yet. So trying to get guests on could not have been easy at times. I mean, because there wasn't the cell phones. Like I remember one time listening to Evan Roberts, he had said, we probably wouldn't be able to have the amount of guests on we do without cell phones. So how challenging was that back in 93 being a producer? And I mean, one thing about a producer, who's ever show they're producing, that hosts want them to get them guests. So, I mean, was it stressful at times?
Stressful, yeah, because it's kind of your job. I think it wasn't that we got more. Like, I think we probably actually got more guests back then because I think we worked at it differently. I don't think today's shows are as guest driven. Let's put it that way. I mean, they work hard at different aspects of the show besides just booking guests. And it was just a different avenue. Like now, like you either, once you get somebody's cell phone number, that's their cell phone number, right? Or you have different avenues on social media in order to maybe reach out to people. You still, you just use different things. You just call offices of people and either call. You had office numbers. We had Rolodexes. I still have somewhere my phone book that I kept. Of with people's phone numbers in it, and this producers of the station, you'd say, hey, do you have a number for this guy, do you have a number for that guy, which is very similar to probably what people do now with cell phones. But you'd call an office number, or you'd call you'd call somebody with a team and try to get you build relationships with people with that team and say, hey, can you get me in touch with this person or that person? Sometimes you'd end up calling 3 or 4 or 5 people just to get the right number of the right person. I don't think it's any easier now or easier then. I just think it was just, you just ended up working phones differently than you did before.
Right. So let me ask you, Sweeney, like I said, I talked to Ed Coleman about this, and it's a little different as a producer, but I'm sure it's the same. Even though, like, say you're producing Joe Beningo's show and he goes on 1 a.m. in the morning, you're not getting there 12:45 in the morning. You're getting there probably around 10:30, 11 o'clock, because you got to really prepare. You got to make sure you have everything in order. So a lot of times producers, update guys, hosts of shows, people think, oh, wow, it's 3 to 6, no big deal. But they have to come in a lot earlier to prepare for those shows, correct?
Yeah, I guess my shows, when I was producing overnights for Steve Summers, which is my first job, I'd probably get in around 10 o'clock for the midnight show. Yeah. I moved up to the daytime, to the evenings. I moved to the evenings, which is basically like after Mike and Chris. So it was like 6 or 6:30 to midnight. And I would probably get in around 3 o'clock then, 2, 3, and 4. But the other part is, like, you're kind of always on. Like, I can't, if I'm looking to call people, at those are the hours I work, but most of the business world still works, 9 to 5, right? So I reach people in those hours. So I was, I'd be calling people from my house, and when I woke up, and trying to reach people then, and you'd leave them 2 different phone numbers because it wasn't cell phones, right? I'd leave them my home phone number if they wanted to call me back, and I leave them the radio station number, says I'll be here after this time, or this is the number to call in. And so you kind of start your groundwork early in the day, calling people from home. And I still remember, like, I would get different weird answering machine messages, from people, that I was reaching out to. Like, I just remember, like, my brother one time came home, and when I was staying with him, and he had a message from Bud Selig on his answering machine, because I had reached out to him. I came home one time, and my college friend Sean and Marv Albert were both on the same answering machine messages, because this is the people that I called or reached out to from home. So those are, I think it's still, I mean, now we're kind of 24/7 just with cell phones. And I'll tell you another thing, just go back to kind of something you just said. You kind of had to, now I think we email and text a lot of people and ask for guests that way. You had to pick up the phone and talk to somebody. That's a different skill, right?
Yeah.
And to kind of have a little bit of rapport with a person, or build a relationship with people in those few seconds you're talking to them, and get to know them that way, as opposed to getting to know them over DMs or texts. There's there is a different feel for how you interact with people when you're talking to them, and having the right tone of voice, a pleasant tone of voice, and be friendly with people in that particular way, which can come across differently than whether it's text. So again, I don't think one is easier or harder than the other. I just think it's a lot different, and it just, you use different skill sets to do it each way.
You make a good point about that, though, because when you're calling somebody, you have to hope too that they don't take it as a prank or something like that, and they don't hang up the phone, where if you text or email, you're guaranteed to get what you're trying to do. You get your point across on there. So you're right about that. That is challenging. Now, Sweeney, we're going to get to Joe in a second, but I was talking to Eddie C about this, because he, like I said, did the updates for Steve Summers. You must have had such a blast doing, producing his shows, because, I mean, you talk about a guy who makes his show perfect to a T. That is definitely Steve Summers. He's a very entertaining guy. So that had to be so much fun for you. Is my first 6 months at the radio station was producing for Steve Summers. And
it was crazy. Like I was there the night that Jerry Seinfeld called for the very first time. You know, it was and Steve telling the story how he ran into him in a grocery store and you know on the Upper East Side on Saturday night, and then Sunday night at midnight, here he is. He's on the radio station calling in. I had fun trying to track people down and get certain bits going with Steve, and you know, kind of get into the like just the meat and potatoes what his show was. I wasn't there long. I ended up moving up. We had some movement at the radio station. I ended up moving up to a different show. But you know, I still got to see Steve and work with him on a few other things along the way. You know, he's such a great friend, such a warm personality. You know, he was at my wedding. We are just talking. I was just sharing stories with people the other day about, you know, Steve Summers at my wedding, and just a warm, kind person that I miss seeing around the radio station. I really do.
Yeah, he really was. And I mean, his audience loved him. I mean, and the fact that a guy like Jerry Seinfeld, who is as big as he is, would still call the station when Steve was on the air. That says a lot about Steve.
The story of meeting him was just awesome. You know, like it's a Saturday night in 1993. And Jerry Seinfeld's the biggest star on TV, right? Yeah. Seinfeld is the #1 show on TV. Couldn't get any bigger. Well, they're in a little bodega on the Upper East Side, and Steve Summers, you know, walks out at like 1 a.m. to go get some ice cream, and he sees Jerry Seinfeld. He's like, oh my gosh. So he just quietly walks up to him and says, he pulls a business card out of his pants, and he says, I'm sorry, I don't want to bother you. I just want to say I'm a very big fan. And he hands him a business card. And Seinfeld looks at the card and says, you're Steve Summers? I'm a big fan of yours. And wow, mind-blowing, right? So that's kind of how that started. And the next night he called in and did an hour with Steve on the radio, and it was just gold. It was fabulous.
Yeah, it definitely was. So around 1997, Sweeney, if my math is correct, you start overnights doing the updates with Joe Beningo. And nights are hard, Sweeney, but I got to believe when you're doing updates with a guy like Joe Beningo, you're always going to be entertained, especially when there's a Jets loss on a Sunday. If the Mets are on a 5-game losing streak, if the Knicks aren't playing well and he's screaming about Dolan. I mean, those 4 years you were with Joe, I mean, your nights had to be so much fun. It wasn't like a job. It was like having fun coming to work.
I had a pretty good seat for some epic Joe rants and meltdowns. And, you know, I think fortunately for the rest of us and unfortunately for him, his teams over the course of the next couple of decades performed relatively the same in most years, so that you got to hear the same kinds of rants over and over again. Yeah. I was 19, and actually in 1997, I actually left FAN for a year. I went to WIP in Philadelphia.
Oh, okay.
My first full-time on-air job. I went from June of 97 back in June to June of 98. And then in July of 98, I started at FAN again as a full-time on-air person on the overnight updates with Joe.
Right.
So yeah, and so I did that for about 2.5 years, and like there's still something cool to me about, you know, about being the person that gives them the news. You know, this is, you know, before iPhones, you know, people didn't get all their stuff. You had to turn on the radio and listen for the scores and the news, and we did updates every 20 minutes, and even that maybe it was a little too often back then, but it was still kind of appointment radio for some people. And there were a lot of people around the city who would still be tuning in at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., driving around, either getting home or getting up for their early morning shifts. And they'd be listening to Joe do his show, or they'd be listening for the scores. You know, my dad, living in central Pennsylvania, would fall asleep before most of the games were over. So he would have a radio by his bedside. He'd put a little earpiece in. He'd listen to FAN, which you could pick up pretty clear that time of night. And he'd listen to me give him the scores of the games that he fell asleep to. So that's always something that I've always kind of enjoyed about it. And, you know, so just the idea of being the one giving people the news, that was kind of like, I still remember in high school saying, like, I want to be the one telling people what happened. Like that was a cool job. And you know, the job is evolved over the years because people get their information in so many different ways. But still the basic idea of turning on the radio and hearing somebody tell you what happened, that was kind of what I wanted to do.
Right. So talk to me about being an update guy, Sweeney, because I know John Manco, who, to me, when I think of updates, you got to think of John Manco, Bob Husler, Joe Tallison, Rich Ackerman, guys like that, who just did it so well. But John Minko would always say that your updates should be no more than about 2 minutes, maybe 2.5 minutes. So how important is it for you that whatever information you're getting, to make sure that you don't go over what the required time is?
Yeah, I mean, listen, that's just format, right? And we all have our own styles a little bit as far as how we present it, but you're tasked with doing it in the same time. So it's it's a lot like, everybody doesn't have the same batting stance, right? But their job is the same thing. You're trying to hit the baseball. And so, like, we're all trying to do the same thing. Stylistically, I think we pick different things, different people. I would pick things from John Minko, from Bob Husler, from everybody. And, Bill Daughtry, who I worked with closely for a few years.
Yeah.
All these guys are people that I would pick little things from, and ended up kind of weaving all that into my own style. So yeah, I mean, listen, you're tasked with getting in and out of the show. The show is the most important thing, but you still have an element of it that you're in charge of, and you want to do it the best you can each time.
Right. One of the things I talked to Eddie Coleman about, Sweeney, is the importance of FAN. I think is the callers. I really do. Now, I mentioned to him about Doris and Regal Park because when we were talking about the Mets, that big run, and I really think of how special it would be for Doris if she were around today to see this Mets team. But one caller that I know you had to enjoy, yourself and Joe, actually two callers I think of. I think of Jerome from Manhattan, and I think about the Prophet from Queens. Of course, Short Al, Bruce from Bayside, Bruce from Flushing, and Miriam from Forest Hills. Talk about the callers and how important they were.
Well, especially overnight, because things are a little bit looser. There wasn't as much happening. There isn't as much commercial time. There's not a lot of changing storylines and stuff, and you're more of a soundtrack, and it's more of a longer conversation. And a lot of times it became therapy. Especially when you're talking about Joe, like talking about all his teams that come up short. There were therapy sessions for these callers, and you're talking about a lot of people you're talking about are older people who would just stay up in the middle of the night, listening to the radio, and we're their companions, so that's a responsibility there. It was, I think Joe and Steve both talked about, because they're the ones who interacted with those callers the most, talked about the idea of just it being their own little family. And every night it was the same people together every night and talk to each other and console each other and celebrate with each other. And it was, there was definitely a certain feel. Like I think in the daytime, it's about the hosts. And at night, because it was a little bit looser and a bit longer flowing conversation, it did become more about those specific callers.
Yeah, I mentioned a couple to you, but like this guy, I don't know where he is these days, but I really enjoyed the Prophet from Queens, especially he'd end every conversation with ciao. He was just such like a, entertaining caller. And then, of course, Jerome and then Short Out. And what was really cool, Sweeney, is you would fill in sometimes for Joe when he was on vacation. And you kind of gave Short Out the nickname Short when you talked to him. So you guys had that love with the callers that was so nice to see, and it always made me want to call the show on the overnights.
A lot of these guys you develop, like, because when I was producing with Steve or even the other shows, like I would develop relationships with these guys too, because you're screening their calls and you're having some conversations with them before they go on and do their bit in the show. So some of those guys were fun to talk to. Like I would get to talk to them for a couple of minutes for several years off the air, and then have those conversations with them on the air. It was pretty cool. Yeah.
So Sweeney, and I would say probably February, maybe March of 2000, Susan Waldman moved up to the midday show with Jody Mack. So she covered the Yankees the rest of that season, but it was obvious with her Yankees responsibilities and her midday show responsibility, covering the Yankees every day for the fan was going to be very hard for her to juggle everything. So you take over for Susan in 2001, but let me ask you, did they approach you? I mean, was there like a position available to be the Yankees beat writer? How did that come about?
In the summer of 2000 is when I think Jody and Susan took over for Russ and Steve.
Yeah.
So I don't remember the exact timing of that or how long it took for me to approach, but it was probably in like June or July in 2000. You know, it was probably shortly after. I remember the morning it happened. I just don't remember exact timing of it, but it was probably sometime in June of 2000. I walked into Mark Chernoff's office. Mark was our program director, and he would get there super early in the morning. He'd be in by like 6 or 6:30 every morning, and my overnight shift would always end about 5:40. I think was my last update. So
Yeah.
I would rarely cross paths with him, but occasionally I would. So this one morning, I just stuck around an extra half hour to catch him in his office, and I said, "Hey, Mark, I've got some things happen. You know, I've got some things I want to ask you about. There were three things I had on my list, and I said." Well, because this was 2000. I was, starting my third full year of overnights because I started in summer '98.
Yeah.
And so I said, listen, I know Beningo's taking vacation a little bit later on. I know sometimes you have a hard time filling those slots. I'd, I'd be interested in, maybe hosting some of those shows if, if you needed that. He's like, oh, okay. And I see him write something down on his planner. I said, I know Ed Coleman is going to take some vacation later this summer and Mets Extra, and I'd really like to, I'd really like a chance to host that, when he's out, because the year before I'd actually done Phillies pre and post for a few weeks while Scott Graham had been on an NFL assignment.
Right.
I got a chance to do that. So I had some of that experience of, listen, I've been an on-air guy at our station for 3 years doing updates and filling in different things. So I think they knew what I could do. I had the experience of hosting that. And I said, I'd really like the chance to fill in for Ed Coleman when he is. Okay, so Mark writes that down. And I said, and it was probably shortly after Susan had taken over the show with Jody. And I said, I don't know what your plans are for the Yankees next year, but I just want you to know that I'd be interested. And he went, oh, okay. And I saw him write that down. So like, that was really the start of me, that was my pitch to them, is like, and listen, I've been around the radio station for, 8 years at the time. Mark Chernoff hired me, right? Like officially hired me as a producer. So everybody knew me. Everybody knew how much I liked baseball. Everybody knew how much I, appreciated the history and all that stuff. And I'd covered some weekend games here and there just as a stringer. And, everybody at the station, I think, who was in charge kind of knew that, like, this is what I really enjoyed the most. And I, thankfully, fortunately, they, I don't know who else was considered, to be honest with you, but they kept me in mind the whole time. And by the end of, I had gone to Sydney, Australia in September of that year to do some coverage for Westwood One of the Summer Olympics. So
right.
I won in 1996 to the Atlanta Games, but I was more of a production role there for the radio coverage. And in 2000, I was part of the on-air coverage. And so I came back from that. I was like, okay, this is, I've done a lot of different things in the course of the last year. I've hosted some shows. I've hosted, I've done different reporting. And I think by that time I just kind of, I established kind of a voice on the air. People knew my voice because, I was on a lot, and, they gave me the Yankees. They,
right.
by I think around the Christmas party that year is when I was kind of pretty much told that would be my gig. And so I started preparing for that. I left my last update with Joe was like, I think probably shortly after the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And then I went to spring training in February 2001.
Right. Now, you're a history of the game. You love baseball, as you know, like it's your number one sport. So obviously, the history of the Yankees. So covering the New York Yankees, I don't care, even if you weren't a fan of them, that has to be like a dream for a guy who's in broadcasting or who's, in journalism, whatever it might be, a reporter. That had to be a dream come true for you because it is the New York Yankees.
For the last 22 years, I say I work at the biggest radio station and I cover the biggest team. I mean, this is, I grew up, wanting to be on the radio, and I grew up being a baseball fan. Well, now I work at WFAN and I cover the New York Yankees. Like what's, I don't know how much higher I'm supposed to strive for if those are my goals at that particular point in time. So, yeah, it's, and from that day in 2001 to now, it's kind of the same idea of, we are the biggest radio station and the Yankees are the biggest team, popularity and all that stuff. So, yeah, that's never been lost on me. Absolutely.
Right. So let me ask you, was the first year a little overwhelming? Not so much the season, but spring training, especially because one thing about being covering the Yankees or like Eddie covering the Mets, you guys got to go to every spring training game. So you're in Florida, you're trying to figure out where the away teams, stadiums are in Florida, stuff like that. I remember one time, Sweeney, you talked about that. You drove like an hour and a half somewhere and you get right to the game and they say the game's rained out. So, I mean, there were no GPSs back then. You basically, if you didn't know where you're going, you had to go ask somebody at a gas station, use a map. So was that part challenging at times for you?
Listen, we had explorers like hundreds of years ago found places without, just by pointing themselves in one direction and going, right? I mean, yeah, it wasn't that bad, but listen, 7 weeks in Florida, you're talking to somebody who had just spent, spent 3 years doing overnights. So in the winters, I come home and it's dark and I get up and it's dark. Like, you're telling me 7 weeks in Florida? Yeah, sign me up for it. I'm there. I actually think I went a week early so I could play golf for a little bit and then get used to everything. It was not, that part was not hard to convince me to do. Yeah, it's fun. It's, you can go to a bunch of different places. And I think the length of the season is probably what stood out that first year, because, you went from, first week in February is when I went to spring training, or second week in February, and the World Series ended first week in November. It was a long year. I covered a lot of games. I logged a lot of miles, flying around. And I was younger. I turned 31 that year. So body wasn't quite beat up, but it is a different experience. It is a different, and you end up figuring out like what day games after night games really mean, and go flying from coast to coast and getting up and doing those things. It's a challenging thing, but it was all new and it was fun, and then you're going to different places and seeing different cities and different parks, and getting to talk about baseball. It was pretty cool.
Right. And one thing, Sweeney, that fans want though, they want to know what the manager is saying each day, whether it be how is Roger Clemens' calf, how is Derek Jeter's shoulder, whatever it might be, or, how does it look with Tino Martinez at first base or Jason Giambi replacing them, things like that. So you have to always try to get as much coverage to the fans as you can, because they are waiting for your spot, whether you come on Mike and the Mad Dog or you come on Joe's show, wherever it may be. They want to hear what's going on with the team leading up to the season. So let me ask you, that first year, how'd you do as far as getting interviews from players, talking to Joe Torre, stuff like that? Was it hard at times, or were they very accessible?
I think you just kind of feel, they're all kind of made available in various particular points in time, but like to get your own personal time with them, you kind of had to figure out, best way to do it. I didn't go in there trying to be, Derek Jeter's best friend on day one. I went around trying to talk to everybody and getting to know all the different players. And I knew I was in this for the long game. I wasn't trying to get in there every, first week I was there and get Joe Torre and Bernie Williams and Paul O'Neill and Derek Jeter to be, whoever and tell me everything. I was, I took it slow, and I kind of, I did a game earlier this year, play-by-play. First time I got a chance to do it. And Aaron Boone's advice to me was, let the game come to you. Right. And I actually thought, like, wow, that's pretty cool. It sounds simple. It's a cliche, but he's right. And I think that's kind of what I did then. I kind of let the game come to me, and I didn't, I knew I wasn't just there for a week. Right. So let's just kind of let this happen and figure it out. And I ended up developing my relationships slowly with everybody, and did what I could do best I could.
Right. And that first year was a memorable year for a lot of reasons, Sweeney. Obviously, the tragedy that happened with 9/11, and then you got to cover so much of the playoffs and World Series all the way into November. I can remember you being on with Mike and Chris all the time, and then you were on with Mike on his solo shows. You even talked about that. The Yankees were up 3-2, and you said to Mike, I've been here for 9 months. What's another day? So you were hoping for a game.
You remember that? That's exactly right. We were in Game 6 in Arizona, and he was asking me what I thought was going to happen, and I was, like, why not? Let's just get to Game 7.
Yeah. So, I mean, your first year,
He
I
didn't
mean,
appreciate because they were up 3-2. He wanted them to win it right there.
yeah. And I believe me, when you said it to him on the air, I was like, Sweeney, no, please. But it did happen, and it was obviously a heartbreaking loss. But that first year, Sweeney, I mean, in 1 year, I mean, there were so many things that happened. But I really think about how the players and the fans really came together after 9/11, and you just realize there's so many good people in the world. And like, I look at what Mike and Chris did when that tragedy happened, how they tried to, be on that show and just give fans something to, listen to that was like a distraction. And I think about the players. I think about that Mike Piazza home run against the Braves and things like that. I mean, baseball, the fans, the talk show hosts, everybody, they just came together that year. And I mean, if there was, one thing that came out of all that, it was that it was a group of people that came together.
I just didn't thing ago with Williams for
Yeah.
ticket holder stadium, and Bernie said that the 2001 World Series is easily like his most memorable part of the whole thing because it showed him what his true place was in all this, and what he and the Yankees meant to people. Time it's easily, like he said, his best memory because it showed him that they have a place and a meaning for people who are going through something horrible, and yet their faces lit up when the Yankees walked into the room. And that was so that still resonates all these years later with him and Tino Martinez. And
yeah, you broke up a little bit. I think your thing might have froze. Now I see you. Yeah. Yes, but yeah, you're right. I mean, it really did. And I mean, like I said, I mean, did you feel confident after that first year, though, Sweeney, that like this was something you were fine with doing? If this was the thing you did for the rest of your career, you were okay with that? Yeah, you broke up on me again. Somehow I lost you. We'll try to get Sweeney back, folks. Yep. Now I see you a little bit.
okay.
Yeah, you're coming in and out, but I could hear you now. But did you feel confident that first year, after that first year, that you were good at this job and you knew you could do it long term? You there, Sweeney? I think we lost him again. We'll keep trying, folks. One thing about when you do these Zooms, there could always be Wi-Fi problems, but we'll see if we could get Sweeney back on. He's doing a great job with us, so we really hope that he's able to get back on. But you heard him talk about how so many guys and players think about that year, and they remember that year specifically because of everything that happened. I think about, Paul O'Neill with the fans chanting his name in Game 5. I think about George Bush throwing out that first pitch and what a sight that was and stuff like that. So, I mean, that season really was, like I said, so many people stepped up and responded to each other, and we're still trying to get Sweeney back. Right now, we don't have him, folks, but I'm sure he'll try to pop back on, and when he does, we'll get him back on. He's, like I said, he's done a great job. And one thing about Sweeny Murti, guys, I got to watch or listen to a lot of the overnights with Joe Beningo. I was a big fan of the overnights, and I worked overnights, and you'd always hear Sweeney on doing the updates. But Sweeney was also good about kind of giving some insight on Joe's show. Joe would let him, talk for quite a bit about whether it be the Mets, the Yankees, whoever it might be, the Giants or Jets. And he would always give you a good insight. This guy was very prepared, and he was really knowledgeable. He knew the games inside and out. And I really wanted to have him on today because he just, to me, like him, Ed Coleman, I think of John Minkle, these guys, they may not be the big stars of FAN, but you know what? They give you their very best each and every day. And they really are the unsung heroes. That's what I kind of look at when I see those guys. And you just see what the type of work they do. I mean, think about it in Sweeney's case. He's with the Yankees when probably around February 10th, February 11th, spring training starts. And most seasons, the Yankees are in the playoffs. So say they win a round or whatever it might be, he's going to be with them in the middle of October. So he's with that team a lot. And I think we got him right back. Hold on a sec. Let me just see. But I do think, And we have him back. Sorry about that, Sweeney. I was just saying that when you do Zoom, sometimes the Wi-Fi's act up, so it's to be expected. But we are glad you're back. But Sweeney, you were talking about how so many of the players from that 2001 team talk about how they remember that year specifically more so than the other years. So just kind of touch on that a little bit.
I did recently was season ticket holder, and that specifically is a year that just stood out. It showed him the place that the Yankees.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit again. Yeah, let's see. He's breaking up a little bit. We'll try to see if we could get that Wi-Fi situated. Yeah, it's breaking up a little bit, Sweeney. I don't know if you could hear me, but you kind of.
I can hear it.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing you. It broke up again. Hopefully, I'll just keep talking and hopefully it'll work itself out. But yeah, that was a big season as far as for so many things. And that Game 7 between the Yankees and the Diamondbacks, I mean, that was a classic game, a classic ending. I mean, just everything. Alfonso Soriano hits the big home run, and then you think you're feeling good because Rivera's going to come in and he's going to pitch the 2 innings and close it out. And you got to give the Diamondbacks credit. They came back in that 9th inning and they got the Yankees. So it may have been a disappointing loss, but that 2001 season and those playoffs were special for a lot of baseball fans. Yeah, I see you now, Sweeney. So
okay.
Yep, there you are. So, you know, it happens sometimes with Zoom and stuff like that. But yeah, that 2001 season, Sweeney, was definitely, I mean, from start to finish, I mean, it was a great baseball season. Yeah, he's breaking up again, folks. You know, like I said, Wi-Fi could be very frustrating, and believe me, I know, because sometimes my feed acts up. So we'll see if we could get Sweeney back on. Sweeney's done a great job, but really, folks, when I think about FAN, I think of guys like Sweeny Murti because they just give you so much of their time each and every day, and we're gonna try to get them back on. I mean, I see him right now, but the Wi-Fi is a little off. Sweeney, can you hear me okay?
Everything.
Yeah, you're just breaking up. I can't seem to hear you good. I don't know what it could be, whatever, but I'll keep going. So Sweeney, let me ask you, over the years, you've covered this team, you've seen different personalities, and the one thing about it is, Sweeney, you always are there when a big story happens. You know, when the Yankees get Jason Giambi, or they get AROD, or they get CC Sabathia, you're going to be right there in the heart of everything, covering everything. So just talk about those experiences, because as a Yankee beat reporter, that has to be a lot of fun.
I mean, you're around like the biggest player. That I said before, you know, I work for the biggest radio station, cover the biggest.
We lost him again.
What got into the business for?
Right.
No? You hear me?
I hear you a little. It just keeps breaking up. I noticed when you sit back, I could hear you more. I don't know, maybe if you lean back a little more, because you come in clear. Yeah, right there. I could see you fine. Yeah. It's weird. But I mean, you got to cover so many of those stories. I mean, you got to.
Yeah. I'm around the biggest people, the biggest players.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah, you can't hear me, huh?
I can hear you a little, but it just keeps breaking up. It keeps freezing on you.
I don't know what to do. Like, I hear you just fine, so I don't know.
I apologize for it, but I mean, you get to see something.
How about we just call it a day now?
Yeah, I mean, we could always have you back on, but I do appreciate it. But let me ask you this, Sweeney: you did get to call play-by-play. You did do a game play-by-play this year. Talk about that. That had to be so enjoyable, and you got to do it, I believe, with Susan Waldman, who, again, I mean, she's so respected by the baseball everywhere, and she really, in my opinion, all the women broadcasters that you see, they have to start with Susan and thank her, because she was one of the first. So getting to call that game with her had to be very special for you.
It made it terrific because I've known and worked with Susan for so long, since my first days here at FAN. So to have her next to me and kind of help set me up was really tremendous there.
Yeah. 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 She's one of a kind for sure.
That was an amazing opportunity for me, and it's one that I'm just going to remember. I think my family, my kids got to hear me, and my parents got to hear me. So it's really one of the best days of my career for sure.
Right. And you've become very respected, Sweeney. I mean, you were on Derek Jeter's documentary. I mean, you gave some good insight there. And you've like had a good relationship with the players over the years. And I could think of your second year as a beat reporter. You were given coverage for the Yes Network. You'd fill in sometimes when one of their reporters was out. So, I mean, right away you established yourself as somebody that was very respected by the media.
Listen, I'm fortunate that I've had so many of these opportunities, and you basically just go in there and try to do the job you best. It's not much different than the players. The players sit there and tell you that all you're trying to do is you take 4 good at bats today, and you're trying to get a hit this time.
Yeah, yeah, you definitely do, and you know, Sweeney, obviously we're having those technical difficulties, so I don't want to keep you any longer. I do want to thank you. I don't know if you could hear me, but I really do applaud everything you do. I'd like to have you back on again because we did get cut off, but I really do appreciate everything that Sweeny Murti has provided us uh, over the years. I mean, folks, if you're a Yankees fan, he has given you his very best every single day. You can't say enough about him, and it's unfortunate because I didn't want this interview to end the way it did. It was a great interview, and we just kept having like too many problems. Like it happens sometimes when you got to rely on Wi-Fi. You got to pray that everything goes right. And unfortunately, and it was a great interview. He did a great job. I think the last 10 minutes we struggled to get the feed right, but it really was. I really am appreciative that he gave us, a good hour today. And he's one of those guys, folks, that is the unsung heroes, like I said, of WFAN, because he gives you his very best all the time. Yeah, there isn't a person out there that doesn't respect this man. When you hear Joe Benigno, you hear Mike Francesa, Chris Russo, Steve Summers, they always talk about what a great guy this guy is. And then there's the other guys in the media. Susan Waldman absolutely loves him. Michael Kay raves about him. So, I mean, he's very respected by everybody. And it's just a pleasure that we got to have Sweeny Murti on. And when you look back on it, folks, he is a guy who, he worked for the biggest, or he covered the biggest franchise in sports history. And he did it so effortlessly. He is a credit to the business. And he's one of those guys that when you look back on it, he's the core of WFAN. For Hometown Heroes, I'm Mike Kenichi saying good night, everyone.